Welcome to round 5 of my Zurich 1953 tournament analysis. Round 5 consisted of the 7 games you see highlighted here, and we are going to go through these 2 games because I found them to be the most instructive. The first game really teaches a lot about when to strike, when do you start the attack, when do you start grabbing initiative, and the second game was just a huge chaotic game. I actually ran it through the chess.com engine analysis, and it showed something like 9 blunders and 2 brilliant moves, which are just the 2 extremes. Getting 9 blunders signifies a horrible game, and 2 brilliant moves in one single game signifies just an incredible game. So I found it really interesting to look at that chaos that occurred. So the first game of the 2 is Averbakh, Gligoric, and the opening is quite normal. I mean, we reach this very typical pawn structure where white has great control over d5 with their pawns, which is why c6 is often played in these structures to combat the control white has. But c6 does come with its own weaknesses. It greatly weakens this d6 pawn, and white tries to go after this pawn in many lines. And for black side, black typically tries to target e4 here and perhaps get some good play on the queen side. So in this position, white played the move f3, and the ideas are twofold. There's multiple ideas here. First of all, this isn't quite a novelty, but it is a very unique and creative idea, especially at the top level. And the main 2 ideas that come with it are, well, first of all, to do a rook lift via f2 to d2, and go after this pawn that I just identified as a weak pawn in the future after c6 is played. And typically this is stronger than stacking this way, because when you put your queen first, they can defend it with a rook in the future, and your queen will never take that pawn because, of course, that would be very bad for you. Whereas if you first have a rook, then if they defend with a rook, there's cases where you can take anyways, of course. So typically it's stronger to attack with your least powerful piece first. Now, also, the idea of f3 is to defend this e4 pawn, which I also identified as a weakness, meaning that black will have much less play in the center, and they're going to have to resort to queenside play basically solely. So here, the move a5, exactly what makes sense in this position. We have bishop e3, we have a4, and now the move rook f2. White goes for their plan, and this makes sense. I should note that rook to b1 is also a nice try with the idea of preparing b4 and kicking away this knight or trading in the queen side on white's terms, and there's going to be a few options for white to take with because they have great control over b3. And so that would have been one strategy and one way to play for white going for b4, but rook to f2 is also perfectly fine. Now we have the move c6, also, like I talked about, creating a weakness, but also taking away this massive strength and square on d5. We have knight to c2, trying to open up the position, especially to target this pawn. The queen moves out of the way to e7, rook to d2, and as it turns out, the pawn on d6 is a little bit tricky to defend. Of course, if you go for a rook to d8, then simply bishop takes c5, and you're winning. They can't take because they lose their rook. So for that reason, they have to resort to a different way to defend it. And knight to e8 is just quite passive. Something like bishop d4 maybe, trading the bishops, the knight comes back powerful. And I mean, if we can compare these 2 knights, which one's better, it's quite obvious. So this would have been just a little bit too passive for black and given white some very comfortable play. So for these reasons, black resorted to this move knight f to d7, which does defend d6, even though it doesn't seem like it, because if white gets greedy and takes the pawn, then a3 comes, and there's problems along this newly opened diagonal. If you were to take with the knight, then they can take the knight on c3, and if you take, you lose this knight. If you don't take, well, you just lost a knight, so the point is you're losing a piece in this line, and if instead you push, let's say, b4, counterattacking their piece, well, they can even just move their knight, and you have a lot of pressure and struggle against this diagonal. You'd have to go for something like takes, and queen e1, and perhaps you're surviving, but it's definitely not pleasant, and black has some nice pressure that they've built. So for this reason, instead of taking the pawn, white continued rook to c1, simply getting their pieces more active. We have bishop to e5, and I think the most obvious response against bishop to e5 is this move f4, and so we have to ask what happens after f4. But then the idea was to take, and after pawn takes, because of f4, the pawn is no longer defended on e4 as much, so knight takes pawn, and black has totally infiltrated here. Even if you take back the pawn on d6, black can even just take your pawn here, and this queen is so powerful, whereas this rook doesn't have much of a continuation, especially with how, the bishop and knight are kind of locking up this file, and these pawns are defended. This rook, although it looks powerful, in practical sense, it can't really do much, whereas this queen is still very much apparent as an aggressive piece in white's territory. So for that reason, this would not have been great for white, and instead bishop to f2 was played, dropping the bishop back, maintaining the same pressure and the same nature of the position, and after rook to e8, now came knight to e3, and this was also the secondary idea, moving the bishop back, allowing the knight to come to e3, and later to g4, and question the bishop not with the pawn, which we've already seen as bad, but with a piece, because this bishop is still super powerful, and white does want to get rid of it. So now knight to f8 was played. We have knight to e2, both players shuffling around trying to find their ideal squares. Rook to b1 to defend more nicely the pawn here. a3, we have b3, we have h5, queen to c2, bishop to e6, knight coming back to c3. Again, both players just maneuvering, trying to feel out the position here. Knight to h7, and at some point, white strikes with this move b4. Now this is kind of, I think, the biggest takeaway. A huge tip is only strike with really anything, b4 or f4, or just in general, only strike and initiate some change in the position when all of your pieces are as good as they can get. And I mean, these bishops maybe can improve a little bit, but for the most part, they're okay. The rook's good, the knights are great, the queen's okay. But this rook here, it could be perhaps better. So, for example, rook b to d1, putting more pressure on the d file and then being prepared to strike is a nice improvement to the strategy that white played. And in general, just this concept of improving even very small changes in your position until you have that perfect setup and you're ready to fully strike and there's nothing else that you can do to improve your position. That concept is quite important. But okay, b4 is also good here. Now the knight moves. Now f4, the bishop moves, and f5, and white rams through. And again, it would have been nicer for the rook to be here because this is kind of closed. This is maybe more open, so that's kind of where this comes into play. But f5, the bishop moves. Now queen to b3, with the main idea of putting the queen on this diagonal, realizing that in many cases after takes, this diagonal is going to open up and the queen wants to control it. We have knight to f6, and immediately here f takes. Now, once again, there was this opportunity to first go rook to d1. And again, tying back to this idea of not starting the attack. Even if you're already in the middle of the change that occurred, it's never really too late, except on rare occasions, to just improve your position a little bit and then continue with the attack. So never be scared to take a moment, take a breath, and just move your position, make it a little bit better, and then strike. Because that would have made this move f takes g6 just a little bit more powerful. So pawn takes, we have c5, the bishop blocks, and now c takes on d6, counterattacking the queen, bishop takes, pawn takes, and now bishop drops back. This was a huge, of course, change in the position. The queens came off, and there was a massive change in the nature of the position. And I mean, this becomes a position where both players have interesting play left, and white continues to attack with this move b5, realizing that the rook is left on the b file rather than the d file. So let's at least make use of this and try to open up the b file. And this is also quite instructive because in the end the rook does get quite active here. But after rook to c8, the knight's defended, and this rook doesn't have the ability to actually do much. Rook to a7, for example, trying to go after this pawn and create a passed pawn for white. Well, this allows knight to b5, and after takes, rook takes, there's something like check, the trade, and then knight takes here, and in the end, as you can see, all of black's pieces are opened up to an incredible extent. And so for this reason, white probably did not want to go into this line and instead decided to simply defend the knight, and white here decided to simply go rook to c2, trying to maybe add pressure along the c file. Knight a6, bishop to f1, knight comes to c5, and already black has built so much pressure. Black's position is just much more solid. You can see by simply comparing the bishops. This bishop puts pressure. This bishop cuts along this very long diagonal, and there's some pieces there. This bishop's not doing much, and this one was attacking a knight, but that's about it. And so even by just comparing those two sets of bishops, we can see that black has a bit of a better grip in the position. Also, these knights are just super powerful here. This is going quickly downhill for white, which is why white resorted to this nice final trick. Rook takes, king takes, bishop check, and now this move knight to f5, really hoping for g takes f5, which would allow bishop takes c5, and white has just won a lot of material and a lot of play. But of course, black did not fall into this and simply took the pawn on e4, and after this, it was basically game over, and I believe that white actually resigned in this position, or perhaps they continued playing just for a little bit. Actually, yeah, they did. Just a little bit more play left. But finally here, white did indeed resign, realizing that they're going to lose this a2 pawn. This one's going to promote, and just positionally, they're way worse. So this was a super interesting game, and in that middle game that was very complicated, many pieces on the board, this whole idea of improving all of your pieces before you finally open up the position and strike is a very instructive concept. So this was the first game. Now the second game was Szabo against Bronstein, and this one included, I believe, 9 blunders and 2 brilliant moves. So a huge, just chaotic game that was just a super incredible, aggressive game. And you can already see here, just look at these knights. This is not something that is typical. Now the knight f5 coming and attacking the queen. We have bishop to h3 to defend. Now bishop to f8, bishop to d2. Both players trying to develop. And now the bishop, now that the knight is no longer in need of protection, the bishop hops back to a much better diagonal, which in the future could open up. We have the move g6. And okay, it kicks the knight away, but it does create some weaknesses. Maybe something that white will later attack, and actually white will. Queen to e5, and now f4. And this signifies that white's going for it. Because objectively, I don't think this is great. But it creates a lot of chaos. It opens up white's pieces. And if black's not careful, it could lead white to having some great initiative. And that's exactly what happened, because after queen h5 was played, and better was e takes, followed by, for example, queen d4, where there's just a lot of pressure in this position along these diagonals and files, and black is just holding on perfectly, and there's, this is just a very pleasant position for black. Look at this knight here in the corner of the board. So for this reason, that would have been a good option, but queen h5 is okay as well. The idea is to get the bishop to h3 at some point, maybe trade off the bishops, and put a knight here in a very powerful position, which is why h3 was played. Maybe stopping this idea in the future with something like king h2, and stopping black from ever having pressure on h3. But this does give away a pawn on e2, but white gives away this pawn in order to get a lot of development quickly, and in order just to place their pieces on good squares. And this is exactly what happens. First, rook to d1, the queen moves again, and now g4. White starts to go for it. Queen to c7, bishop to c3, slicing along this diagonal, and now finally a bishop move. So you see that the queen sort of went through this long path here, and it took it a lot of moves. In the meantime, white managed to get a very nice aggressive position. The bishop is powerful here. The queen has abilities to be sent over. The knight's very nice here. While black really didn't have the time to develop their other pieces because they have only been moving that one piece, the queen. So we get this really unbalanced position because, of course, black is up a pawn in material. Now g5 comes, and if you just move away the knight, this is very bad. Something like bishop takes, knight takes, and even knight g4. I mean, the engine, I think, here shows that, objectively, black can defend, but practically speaking, all of these dark square weaknesses are just going to be piling up really quickly. This seems really pleasant for white. So instead of going for this, black decided to complicate matters and played b5. Now here, g takes, f6 was played. Notice that bishop takes is a little bit better because after bishop takes, there's this move c takes on b5. And after the bishop retreats, then there's, for example, knight d5. The knight activates nicely. And then there's this move attacking the knight. And white just gets a lot of play on the queen side, even though white has kind of ignored this kingside attack and left black with a powerful bishop. But that doesn't really matter because if the bishop ever tries to activate, you can see something like bishop takes b2. I mean, white's made so much progress, they can even give away their queen because guess what? They're making another one. And this is basically game over. So for this huge reason, this bishop takes f6 would have opened up the queen and given white good chances on the queen side, but instead of this, g takes f6 was played, and after the bishop retreats, I mean, this is understandable, of course. You've created this very weak square, this very strong pawn, and if the bishop ever leaves this square, you can definitely imagine some checkmating ideas. But finally, white takes the pawn on b5, plays knight d5 anyways, and now plays the move f5, opening up the position not only for the rook, but maybe more importantly for the queen to come in at some point. We have bishop to b7, pawn takes, now knight to e7, putting the knight on a super powerful square, a square where black basically has to take it, because if they move, then the queen can come in, it's going to be game over. So they took it with the bishop, and of course this is great for white. They've got rid of black's dark square bishop, which creates a lot of dark square problems regardless of the position, but specifically looking at this bishop, I mean, it seems almost just already game over. And it definitely, indeed, is great this position is for white. Now here, b4 was played. And the idea was to distract the bishop from this diagonal, even though it was only for a split second, it still gave black some chances to come up with some defensive resources, and they decided to take the pawn away, this very powerful pawn from white's position. And now queen to h6 was played. Now queen to g5, a bit more precise, a bit more powerful, because now you're attacking the rook. And if the rook moves, then rook takes, for example, the knight, and after the queen takes, then queen to f6. And generally speaking, you prefer the queen on f6 instead of h6 in these sort of positions when you have this bishop, because on f6 you stop any sort of f5s or f6, which could in some cases give black some resources, whereas in h6, black does have those ideas of f6 and f5 in some cases. So it's a bit more precise to put the queen on the same diagonal, but it's not necessary, and in this case queen to h6 was played to try to still get some of that attacking chances. And after knight e5, queen g5, I mean, white does have some nice pressure here. Now queen to e8, this was a huge mistake because this allows the move rook to f4 and the rook comes in. Better was rook a to e8, because after rook to f4, there would be this move queen takes d1. So the queen is much more powerful on a4 than it is on e8, and this rook is doing nothing. So you might as well defend the knight with a piece that's not doing anything than take away a piece that's already doing something. So that's a nice conceptual idea. So queen to e8 anyways, rook to f4, rook to c3, now rook to h4, rook takes c3, and this was a massive, massive blunder, maybe the biggest blunder of all. Here, queen to h6 was played, and queen to f6 was simply checkmate. There's no way to put it in other words. This threat, I mean, there is no way to stop checkmate here. Maybe you can like give some checks to the opponent, but after white resolves all of the checks that black will throw at him, there's no way to stop this dark square problem, which will lead to checkmate. But going queen to h6 does give black one resourceful idea, which is this move f5. And this is kind of what I'm talking about. You want typically the queen on f6 rather than h6, because it gives black the idea to defend laterally and also open up the position, maybe giving the king some more escape squares. And this would have been perfectly fine. f6 is less precise, and this is what happened in the game. Because now after pawn takes and rook to g7, there was a super nice final blow here. And this is one of the brilliant moves of the game. It is this move rook d8. Super duper brilliant. And the point is, you want to go queen to h8 here and maybe trade the queens, but well, all you're doing is actually trading. You're not doing much more after that. So better here is rook to d8, because after the queen takes, then this same line, instead of trading, you're winning your opponent's queen. So that's a very nice tactical idea. Giving away your rook, but by doing so, separating the distance between the queen and the king, so this skewer does not leave black with the resourceful idea of king to f7, which would defend the queen in one line, but not in the other. So these small nuances really make these tactical games beautiful and very nice. So g5 here, rook to h6, and here finally black resigned. So this was just super chaotic. Some incredible attacking ideas by white, but this point of putting the queen on f6 rather than h6, we've seen twice in this game be much better. This final blow with rook to d8 was nice. This idea of not bringing your queen, but rather your rook. I mean, this game was filled with instructive moments. So hopefully you enjoyed the game. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I will see you next time. Peace out.